Hey, what's up, everybody? Thank you, Martha, and welcome to Listen and Be Heard Radio. We have another fine author interview. If you want to check out some of our older interviews, please go to listenandbeheard.net. We've interviewed Glennis Redman, who's the current poet laureate of Greenville, South Carolina, among other great writers. So please, again, www.listenandbeheard.net. Today we have a powerful poet who has a forthcoming book. Christian Hanz Lozada is the son of an immigrant Filipino and a descendant of the Southern Confederacy. He knows the shape of hope and exclusion. He authored the poetry collection, He's a Color Until He's Not, and it's forthcoming from Moontide Press. He co-authored Leave with More Than You Came With from Arroyo Seco Press, and his poems have appeared in Hawaii Pacific Review, which was nominated for a Pushcart Prize, Sin Caesar, formerly Dryland, Rigorous, among others. Christian has featured at the Autry Museum and Beyond Baroque. He lives in San Pedro, California, and uses his MFA to teach his neighbors and their kids at Los Angeles Harbor College. Christian, welcome to Listen and Be Heard. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're speaking to us from it's San Pedro, correct?
San Pedro, it's the south of LA.
Well, we want to make the distinction because it's not San Pedro, it's not San Pedro, but San Pedro. Can you talk a little bit about that? Tell us about that particular pronunciation.
It's just what the locals do. This is a port town, so it's very rough and ready. We just had Fleet Week over here where the Navy came out for up until maybe just before the pandemic. The Navy used to warn their people coming on shore not to hang out in San Pedro because it's a little rough. It's a little violent. That's not what we are anymore. We used to be one of the most dangerous places in Los Angeles. That was decades ago. So yeah, like we're very, very much like we won't pronounce things correctly.
Sure.
We have a Cabrillo Beach. It should be Cabrillo, but we call it Cabrillo. Should be San Pedro, but yeah, we call it San Pedro.
Well, I know in San Francisco, nobody calls it Arguello Boulevard. It's Arguello.
Yeah.
And no, I totally understand. You describe yourself as the son of both a Filipino immigrant and a son of a daughter of the American Revolution or the Confederacy. Your book has a lot to do with identity. Talk to us about how these two parts of you influence your poetry and influence your life in general as a teacher and how you navigate the world.
I mean, it's definitely influenced the poetry. This book specifically is it has a framework of these letters that my aunt wrote to her mother as she was running away. And the reason why, and this is my white aunt and my white grandmother, one of the reasons why she was running away. This was during the '60s, so she was part of the anti-war movement. She was part of a lot of protests and stuff. And this is down in Long Beach, and my grandparents were Southern and super conservative. They had moved out here. Just for a better economic advantage, and so my aunt started dating a black dude, and my grandfather beat her up because of it, and so she ran away. And we haven't heard these letters. We haven't heard from her since. So, like, we're talking in the early '70s. We haven't heard from her, and so there's this weird, like, absence and presence that she has throughout my life, because after she ran away, my grandfather left. My grandma basically went like kind of catatonic and suicidal for a couple years, and my mom had to pick up the pieces for the family, and she was like 15 at the time. And so the absence of this aunt, again, it becomes a huge presence in who we are and how we shape our identity. And it shaped our family. It definitely left a gap in masculine role models. So then my mom marries my dad, and she meets him at 18. They get married when she's 19. And then I have this interesting dichotomy where my mom doesn't necessarily know what it is to be married to a person of color. And she's also raising his two kids from a prior marriage, who are both full-blooded Filipino. And it's a lot of this balancing act of trying to, for them, it was just whatever we could do to get by. I mean, you're an immigrant with two kids. And then on the other side, you're putting a family back together that's been broken since you were in your teens. Economically, they were struggling. So it's a lot of poverty, a lot of racial identity that are constantly conflicting. And so my poetry comes from this place of there's no right answer in this. Yeah, my mom could have learned to be more racially culturally knowledgeable and responsive, but she's also just trying to survive. And then on the flip side of things, you have my dad, who, I love my dad, but he admits that he begged, borrowed, and stole to get here. So he'd do whatever he could to make a living, to survive. So having those two forces at play constantly, you start to realize that there's no right answer, and whatever we choose is what we had to, or at the very least, it's the right way for that time. And so a lot of this book is trying to come to terms with that, trying to realize there's no judgment. There can be no judgment. So there's some bad things that are written about in here. There's some good things that are written about in here. And really, at the end of the day, they just exist. They just are. There's no judgment on it.
Yeah, I mean, the letters from the aunt are kind of an anchor to the book, a thread that follows throughout the book that I think is very powerful and very, very effective. Talk a little bit about your father. Now, you said that he, begged, stole, and borrowed. You went through a lot of stuff to get here. Talk a little bit about him. Was he, I guess he was, when he was here, he met, I guess your mother was 18. So I'm assuming that he was probably a little bit older, but still he was probably a young guy. Was he from Cebu, or where exactly from the Philippines? How did he get here?
He's from Cebu. Actually, so it's an Asian thing, right? We don't necessarily talk about our histories all that much.
Yeah.
So how he gets here, he doesn't necessarily say who sponsored him. I believe it was his older brother that sponsored him to come here. I know that and I only learned this from ancestry.com. I know that his citizenship was through marrying my mom.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. My dad, that guy's a character. I'm gonna reveal some dirt. I love him very much, but this dirt is, it doesn't work written on the page because it's kind of unbelievable and too complex. But so he comes over here. He's got his kids back in Cebu still. His sister is taking care of them, and he meets my mom. And he portrays himself as this widower. He's like, yeah, my wife died, and I'm just trying to do all this for my two kids. I'm sending money back home. I'm hoping to get them over here. And my mom totally falls in love with this story. And so she marries him. They have me. The kids come over here. They have I have another brother too. And the funny thing is my dad used to be a hardcore Catholic. He went to seminary before he got married and dropped out. And I add that because he doesn't believe in divorce. So
right, a lot of Filipinos don't. It's illegal, right?
Yeah, yeah.
illegal
And
back in the Philippines. Yeah.
so the way he got out of a divorce was he purchased a death certificate for his wife.
Mm.
So
Oh
she is
man.
officially dead according to the Philippine government.
Oh
And
man.
my dad rode that story that she was dead with my mom for, I think I was like 10 or 11. And his ex-wife tracks him down and was like, hey, what's this that I'm dead? Um, yeah. So my dad, a very interesting guy, is very much like, how do I game the system? How
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
I figure out a way to make it work?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, part of what's interesting here is the issue of being mixed race, and that some of it can be seen as ambiguity, racially ambiguous, Filipino and white. With that mix, some folks look more white, and you wouldn't be able to tell the Filipino side of them. And this causes conflict because the brown part of them is still the brown part of them. I remember when the Andrew Cunanan thing came down, and when I heard the name Cunanan, I knew he was Filipino. I knew. But when you looked at him, he didn't look it. And his name was constantly mispronounced, Cunanan. And then when they made descriptions of him, when they described him, 6'2", 220, I thought he's part white. Because number one, Filipinos, we don't grow that big. We just don't. Um, can you talk about that? I think there was a poem in the book about, or actually not even in the book. I think it was a poem called "Mixed Raced Luck," about neither side really accepting who you are or who you're coming to be in your own consciousness. What's the burden of that, being a mixed race person, in terms of privilege, as opposed to your other siblings, for instance, right? How does that kind of play out, and in your everyday life?
My family is so odd. Like the makeup of us and visually, like we are a very odd mix. So when you said that description of like a 6 foot tall Filipino, I have a cousin who's full blood, or two cousins actually, who are full blooded Filipino. One of them is 6'5",
Oh man.
big dude. Like I'm
Yeah,
tall
yeah,
and thick. This dude is tall and thick. Like
yeah.
he got a full ride for playing football. Yeah. But like for me specifically, my immediate family, it's really weird because my older brothers, they're full Filipino, but they present more like Asian. Right? Like
Mhm.
you can tell there's some Chinese blood from back in the day. A little bit lighter skinned. Um, yeah, and then my younger brother, who's my full brother, he presents white, like long, like light brown hair, really light skin. So being in between becomes like a very odd place because I have older brothers who don't necessarily, growing up, there wasn't, it was really hard to stake an identity towards being Filipino. And my mom and my dad tried really hard to say that we were all brothers. It's not about half. It's just we are who we are. My mom, like to this day, will say, "I raised y'all as brothers. Those your older brothers are my kids." It's not an argument. It's a non-starter. So, like staking claim to being Filipino becomes weird for a couple of young boys who have no language because when they came over, my eldest brother was supposed to be in third grade. He was 8. My older brother was 6, and there was no ESL program at the school that my dad wanted to bring them to. So the school said we can take them, but they both have to be put into kindergarten. An 8-year-old in kindergarten is a little
Yeah, yeah,
problematic.
yeah, yeah.
So my dad said, all right, we can't have that. So we will only speak English in this household from now on. If you need something, it has to be, if you're hungry, you're going to starve unless you could ask for it in English. So my older brothers just lost that language right away. They lost a lot of, just cultural touchstones that don't exist anymore. So growing up, anytime I would try to stake my identity towards being Filipino, they would say, no, you're not, you're white. And then I'd go out into the world and everybody's saying I'm a little too dark with this last name. And in Southern California,
Mm-hmm.
at best, I'm Latino, I'm definitely not white. And then I'd have a little brother who doesn't share the same experience at all with me because he's white passing. So he is treated differently from my dad. And he also had some, learning disabilities and stuff like that too. So just layers of intersectional identities, making things very complex and very hard to navigate. So, like I said, the book becomes a lot of just these multiple things that I'm trying to hold in tension with each other, mainly because that's what my life had to be. Is I'm not full Filipino and not accepted by that community that's closest to me, and I'm definitely not white. That grandfather who beat up his daughter, he's still alive. I have never spoken with him. I've been in the same room with him and he hasn't acknowledged my existence.
Mm.
So,
Yeah. That's
yeah.
that's really, being put in a really precarious situation. I relate to what you're saying because I'm part Filipino on my father's side. My father is full Filipino. My mother is part Black and part Irish, and um, her parents were an interracial couple in the 1940s and 1950s. My grandfather, actually, my mother's grandfather, is African American, or was African American. He grew up in New Orleans, and they met in San Francisco. And there were housing covenants that prevented them from renting or owning a home. There was a lot of things that went on. Uh, with one of your or actually, you were talking about one of your brothers being able to pass for white. It reminded me of Brian Escalon Rowley's book American Son. I don't know if you ever read that. It's about I think it takes place in LA, where one of the Filipino brothers is half white and takes on a Chicano identity. It's a book that came out, I think, in the 1990s. It's Brian Ascalon Rowley. It was called American Son. You have a poem, Christian, in the book, The Reason for the Shirk. And I see it as a shift of worlds where you have white and brown, and where memory is kind of blurred, and consciousness of oneself kind of fades, and you really have to be intentional with making sure that you don't forget. If you'd like to share that poem, it would be great if you could read it. If not, talk about that poem, because it really, all the poems kind of popped out, but I really like that one because of the term Manoy that you use, Manoy, which refers to older brother in Cebuano, and I think in Ilocano it's Manong, which I've always used. And I did, not growing up with those words, that was the word that made all the difference in the world for me as being a Filipino American. It was that word that anchored me, that it was a touchstone, that everything else that I lacked didn't matter anymore. That meant everything. Talk a little bit about that poem and that word.
Yeah, you want me to read the poem?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Just so I get a refresher.
Yeah.
The reason for the shirk. I called Brown Brothers Manoys without knowing what it meant or why they deserved it, but I knew it had because I told you so power. I grew up having to call them elder because it was custom, a holdover of a life that Brown Dad tried to shirk daily, that Manoys had to shirk from their tongues, that I had to shirk before it was mine. I had to call them Manoy when I caused the shirk. For them, an anchor baby was a promised drowning, a white thing that needed no title. When I grew under the weight of Manoi and what it meant to them, I shirked it like I was trained to. But in that move, I cut off the tip of my own tongue, that last sweet receptor that let me know what home could taste like. I'm left with phantom flavors, and the language in my mouth tastes salty like the ocean, metallic like force, and bitter like oppression.
Talk about how that is like cutting off the tip of your own tongue. I mean, that really stayed with me. It really resonated, and it kind of just sent aftershocks throughout my body.
When I mean, it happened mostly in my teens, right? Because when in your teens, you start like growing into yourself, into like who you want to be as an adult and stuff. I started going by Christian instead of Chris. And when I looked at my older brothers who were mean, they were mean to me, especially along the lines of being Filipino. I'm like, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to call you this title of respect. I don't know what it means. My family's racist. Like my dad doesn't say anything nice about being Filipino. We don't celebrate anything. All I have is this word, and the word has been used against me so often where it's like, no, you are the younger, I am putting you in your place. So now that I'm getting closer to being a man, I'm not doing it anymore. In retrospect, like you pointed out, like this is a touchstone. Like I should go deeper into who I am and where I come from this word. And I didn't. I just severed it entirely to the point where it took me years to realize what I had lost in just that, the last shred, that last little bit of who we are. And I willfully and ignorantly just cut it out.
I could totally relate. I mean, that poem really, really got to me. I totally understood how that could happen. You know, one thing about separation, be it geographical or emotional, is that everybody kind of loses. You know, when things get severed, you know, the person that does the severing loses it. They don't win. The person, you know, in the severing, you lose a connection of who you are. There are a couple of poems where there's a geographical separation. You mentioned the name John Fante, who was a great writer from LA. I guess he's spent time in San Pedro. Yeah, Wait Until Spring Bandini, one of the greatest books that were ever written. Much love, rest in peace, John Fante. But there's this separation geographically between the people up on the hill and where you're at. Can you address that in terms of, you know, what that's like and how that affects you emotionally, and how you push through as a poet, as an artist, to try to reconcile and try to make sense of it?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, I mean, it could be a question of my background, like living in poverty, or just trying to find an identity the long way around, like through books rather than through people. But I enjoy like losing causes, and I enjoy symbolism. So where I live, San Pedro, is on a peninsula, so it's the closest thing to an island you could get without being an island. And this area is so conflicting in its characteristics. On one side, you have LA, the port of LA, which is has the most business coming through it than any other port in the world, I believe. Definitely, like, I mean, last I read, it was like $3 billion worth of merchandise come through here a day.
Wow.
Yeah. But right next to that port, like on the water, I mean, it's a working waterfront, you have projects. Like serious poverty. We call them the lows. It's everything that's below the street, below Pacific, is called the lows, and a lot of it is impoverished. And weirdly, as you go uphill away from the water, things start getting more economically advantageous to the point where once you reach the top of the hill, you're in Palos Verdes, which is no longer San Pedro. Like there's a hard line between San Pedro and RPV, so Rancho Palos Verdes, all Palos Verdes estates, all that other stuff. And so we are the closest to money, but also the furthest away from it. And the people up on the hill who, I mean, I know some people that live up on the hill who don't commute by car because they don't want to deal with it. They will fly a helicopter to work
Oh
down the
yeah,
hill.
yeah, yeah.
You know? And the air itself, since if we have a west, an eastern blowing wind from the ocean, the air is blocked because the hill is on the west side of us.
Mm.
So yeah, everything's like about 10 degrees cooler up there than it is down here. And where I used to live, one of the reasons why I picked San Pedro, the only house we could afford, was in Bandini Canyon. John Fante over
John
there.
Fante, yeah.
Named his character after Bandini, which was like a manure, like a fertilizer company. But I lived in Bandini Canyon, and it got like 20 degrees hotter than whatever was happening up on the hill. So just living down there, I was just always so mad because everything was always so hot and the air was stagnant. And you drive up just a little ways and everything's fine. And Bandini, the canyon, but there's also a Bandini street over here, is the color line, where you brought up those covenants saying that you couldn't. Bandini was the red line, where houses below Bandini were allowed to be sold to people of color. Houses above Bandini had those covenants. My house, the one I live in right now, is above Bandini, and it has that covenant. It says that it's not allowed to, you're not allowed to sell it to, quote, blacks or Orientals. So yeah, like this place is amazing because of its internal conflicts. We don't want to be part of LA, but we're part of LA. LA keeps a hold of us because of the port. So we are actually LA City proper. If you put San Pedro on your address, though, your mail will get shipped to other places in LA that have the same street addresses. And computers will just start auto-correcting and go with LA instead of San Pedro, even though the zip code should send it to your house. It's a regular thing where like I have to track down a package that went up to downtown LA.
What's funny is the irony in this, because you have Bandini, who is a character in a John Fante novel, who was all about telling the stories that, he was a poor Italian, but there were Mexicans, there were people of color in his books. And then with the mail snafu, you have Mr. Bukowski, who, San Pedro, worked for the post office, hated it. I think Bukowski said that, a lot of humanity's problems could be solved if you could find a way to get rid of the mailbox. But speaking of Bukowski, there was a book that he did called Septuagenarian Stew, a collection of poems and short stories. Not his best book, but it was the one that really, after I read that, I kind of found my voice. It was almost like I got permission. I just got permission to kind of say what it was I needed to say. After reading that, I thought, wow, this guy's saying things that I'm feeling, right? So I just went for it. And he was a great influence. I listened to some of his CDs, and, he says San Pedro. So I knew if he's saying it, then that's the right way to say it. We're going to have to wrap up. It's been fantastic talking to you about this new book. Is there anything else that you want to leave us with? Information on how to get your book, or look at your work online, or whatever.
Obviously hit me up on Instagram at poet Loz, poet Loz. The book comes out Mood Tide Press later this year. I'm told it's supposed to be September, October. I'm gonna be late with stuff. Like that's just how that works. So later this year, just in time for Christmas presents. But yeah, it should be on my Instagram. I also have a website that definitely looks like it's not done because it's not called readuntillmorning.org. I had a bookstore for a little bit that was under that name. So me and my co-writer for my first book, we still use that. But yeah, and then I'm actually working on a book about Bukowski and Bukowski San Pedro. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that.
That's fantastic. Again, he's a color till he's not. It has a character in here who describes, I guess, the internal negotiations and concessions. It's Monster, is that correct?
Yeah.
And I guess Monster would be your own internal. You come across as anything but a monster, but as with monsters, there's passion, there's fire, there's the drive, and I feel that. And again, congratulations on this book. I can't wait for it to come out and to see it in print. I have seen the electronic version, and what I really like about it is that you're telling the story, and it doesn't come across like a slogan. It's not judgmental, and it's very unique, and you're saying it in your own voice. That's very unique to you. Because I know with some writing nowadays, it comes across sometimes as a slogan, and then things get a little repetitive. But for you, I can tell that it was written with love, even though there's some very tough territory, tough waters that you had to navigate. All in all, it was really, when you come down to it, really told with love.
Thank you for seeing that, man.
I owe you a blurb too, and I know I'll get that off to you. Can't wait for the Bukowski book. That's gonna be something.
That's an interesting project because my friend, like she's basically my adopted sister, and I were already working on just the like Bukowski and San Pedro, and we actually had bookmarked every time he made a San Pedro reference. And so she was a historian. So she was doing research on the different places that he'd been to and all the little stories that came up from that. So the book becomes an interesting thing in that she passed away last year with it partially written. So
okay.
It's like weirdly reaction poems to these poems and these places with her little histories kind of throughout, like kind of haunting it throughout. So it's a lot of ghosts is what I'm working on.
I did meet Neely Cherkovsky. He wrote the biography of Charles Bukowski. He also wrote the biography of Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He's based in San Francisco, and Bukowski in some of his writings mentions a guy named Neely, I think Neely Cherry. The guy's name, Neely Cherkovsky, his real name is actually Nelson Cherry. That's his real name. His pen name is Neely Cherkovsky. In some of Bukowski's writing, he mentions a guy named Neely Cherry, I think, or something like that. It may have been Open City or something like that. But anyway, Christian, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure speaking with you again. Christian Lozada, forthcoming book, He's a Color Till He's Not. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And we will send it back to the studio. And Martha, again, check us out online, www.listenandbeheard.net. And that's it for another interview here on Listen and Be Heard Radio on WPVM 103.7 FM, the voice and voices of Asheville.